The heat rises long before the crowd sees him. At the center of the Roman Colosseum, fire roars beneath a massive iron cauldron, sides glowing red as thick oil bubbles and spits into the air. Smoke drifts upward in slow twisting ribbons. The smell is heavy, a mix of burning fuel, scorched metal, and fear. Tens of thousands press forward in the stands, shouting, laughing, mocking, straining to watch what they believe will be another spectacle of imperial power. Soldiers stand in formation, their armor reflecting the flames. The crackle of fire blends with the rumble of the crowd until the whole arena feels alive, like a single giant creature waiting to devour a man. Into this violent storm of noise and heat, an old figure is led across the sand. His hands are bound, his steps are steady, his eyes are calm, and yet every person watching knows exactly what is about to happen. The oil is boiling so fiercely that droplets burst into the air like sparks. The entire scene looks impossible, unbearable, and final. Then the executioner raises his arm. A voice rises from the stands, half excitement, half cruelty. And in the middle of all that chaos, one truth hits the crowd like a stone dropped into water. This man is about to be thrown alive into boiling oil. But the moment he falls into that cauldron, something happens that no one in the Colosseum expects. He does not scream. He does not burn. He does not die. Why? Why does the oil not consume him? How does a human body survive? What should have ended his life in seconds? And who was this man whose survival silenced soldiers, confused rulers, and left an entire empire terrified? His name was John. Not just any John, but the last living apostle of Jesus Christ. The one known as the beloved disciple, the one who stood at the cross when others ran. The one to whom Jesus entrusted his own mother. The gospel describes that moment clearly. In John 19:26 and 27, Jesus speaks to his mother and to John with the words, "Behold thy son, and behold thy mother." And in the opening of one of his letters, he emphasizes that he is not passing on distant stories or second-hand tales. He writes in 1 John 1 verse 1 that he proclaims what he has seen with his eyes and touched with his hands. John was a direct witness, a voice that carried the weight of experience, a living bridge between the earthly ministry of Jesus and the next generation of believers who never saw him in the flesh. That alone made him a powerful threat. Rome understood this perfectly. This was not merely the execution of an old man. This was an attempt to silence the last surviving eyewitness of events that had already shaken the empire. John refused to worship the emperor as God. He refused to bend his knee to Domitian's command. His teachings continued to strengthen Christian communities across Asia Minor. Wherever he went, faith grew. Wherever he spoke, courage spread. Every time he shared what he had seen, Rome's control loosened. So the empire decided to make an example of him. Kill the last apostle publicly. Destroy the final thread connecting the movement to its origin. Break the symbol, and you weaken the faith. But if they failed, if he somehow survived, his survival would send a different message. A message Rome feared far more than rebellion. It would be a sign that the God he proclaimed was real. It would ignite faith instead of extinguishing it. That is exactly what happened. The story of John and the cauldron is more than a dramatic scene. It is one of the most mysterious and debated moments in early Christian history. Did it really happen? Is it a miracle? A legend? A symbolic tale told by early believers? Or is there historical evidence to support it? Today, we are going to explore every part of this mystery. We will walk into the Colosseum, through the smoke, through the heat, and into the minds of everyone who witnessed that moment. We will uncover what ancient writers, church historians, and modern scholars have said about this event. We will examine how the empire viewed John, why they feared him so deeply, and why his survival became one of the most powerful testimonies in Christian tradition. We will break down the story into clear pieces. First, we will look at the world that shaped John, the world he lived in, and the empire that wanted him silent. Understanding that background reveals why this was not a random execution, but a carefully planned political maneuver. Second, we will analyze the event itself. How was the execution prepared? What do historical and religious sources say about what truly happened in the cauldron? And why do so many early writers insist that John came out unharmed? This is where fact, faith, and mystery collide. Third, We will explore the aftermath, Rome's reaction, the shock of the crowd, the fear of the emperor, and the unexpected decision that changed the course of one man's life and the future of the Christian faith. Because this moment did not end with the Colosseum. It led John to a rocky island called Patmos, where he would receive visions that shaped the final book of the New Testament. Everything you are about to hear comes from ancient sources, historical analysis, and the testimony of early Christian writers. This is not just a story, and it is not a fairy tale. It is a mystery woven through history, faith, persecution, and divine purpose. A mystery that continues to raise questions even today. So stay with this video until the very end, because only by following the journey from the fire to the island, to the revelation that still echoes across centuries, can we uncover the deeper truth behind one of the most extraordinary moments ever recorded. The day a man was thrown into boiling oil and walked out alive. Long before John stood in the shadow of the Roman Empire, long before his name carried spiritual weight across continents, he was a young man growing up along the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. The region was alive with movement fishermen hauling heavy nets before sunrise, families repairing boats, merchants shouting across crowded docks. The smell of salt water and fresh catch lingered in the air. Life in Galilee was simple, physical, and demanding. And John grew up right in the middle of it. His family owned a small fishing business, one stable enough that they employed hired workers. A detail mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, in Mark 1:20. We are told that John and his brother James worked alongside their father Zebedee and their crew. This small note tells us something important. The family was not poor. They were hardworking, committed, and firmly rooted in the rhythms of daily labor on the water. John's early years were shaped by discipline and responsibility. Fishing was not a gentle trade. It required strength, instinct, and resilience. A wrong pull on a rope, a sudden storm, or a poor night of casting could mean the difference between profit and loss. Growing up in this environment built a kind of toughness into John, a toughness that would follow him throughout his life. He understood danger, understood physical exhaustion, and understood the importance of teamwork. All of this prepared him in ways he could never have imagined, because one day he would be called into a far greater mission. But raw strength was only part of who he was. John had a fire inside him, a passion that burned hot and reacted quickly. Jesus himself gave John and his brother a nickname that has echoed through history. In Mark 3:1-17, he calls them the sons of thunder. It was not a poetic title meant to flatter them. It reflected something real, something intense in their personalities. John was not quiet. John was not passive. He was bold, expressive, and deeply emotional. We see this fire clearly in one striking moment recorded in Luke 9:54. When a Samaritan village refused to welcome Jesus, John and James reacted with fierce loyalty. Their emotions flared so quickly and so strongly that they asked whether they should call down fire from heaven to destroy the town. That was John, protective, impulsive, and intense. His devotion was not half-hearted. He loved fiercely, defended fiercely, and reacted fiercely. Yet this fiery nature did not make him reckless, it made him teachable. John's passion was not rooted in pride, but in sincerity. He cared so deeply that sometimes his emotions ran ahead of his understanding. But Jesus would later take that intensity and transform it into love, wisdom, and stability. John's sharp edges would eventually become instruments of purpose. The Son of Thunder would one day become the Apostle of Love. Even before John ever followed Jesus, something in him was already searching for truth. The Gospel records that John spent time with John the Baptist, listening to his teachings and watching the crowds gather around the wilderness preacher. In John 1:35-37, we learn that the beloved disciple was already seeking something beyond the ordinary. He wanted answers that neither Galilee nor its fishing boats could give him. He longed for meaning, direction, and truth that reached deeper than the life he knew. And then it happened. One day, while standing near John the Baptist, he heard the words that changed everything. John the Baptist pointed toward Jesus and declared who he was. At that moment, something clicked inside the young fisherman. All the longing, all the searching, all the questions found their direction. Without hesitation, John and another disciple followed Jesus. It was a turning point so powerful that John remembered the exact hour of the day it happened. This early choice reveals so much about who he was. John was young, strong, emotional, and passionate. But above everything else, he was hungry for truth. He would leave his boat, his nets, his routine, and everything familiar. Not because he was reckless, but because he recognized the voice he had been waiting for. His decision to follow Jesus was not blind impulse. It was a response to a calling that had already been stirring in him for years, before he became an apostle, before he witnessed miracles, before he wrote the words that would echo across centuries. John was simply a young man searching for truth along the shoreline of Galilee. And that search, guided by fire and sincerity, is what shaped him into the witness he would become. The one who would stand beside Jesus in his greatest moments, the one who would endure persecution, and the one whose testimony would threaten an empire. There were moments in the ministry of Jesus that only a handful of people ever witnessed. Moments so intimate and so sacred that they were reserved for the disciples who stood closest to him. John was one of those few. His presence in these defining scenes was not accidental. It was intentional, personal, and deeply meaningful. Each moment formed a piece of the bond between the young fisherman and the Messiah he chose to follow. A bond that would later give his testimony a weight no one in the early church could challenge. One of the earliest and most astonishing scenes occurred inside the home of Jairus, a synagogue leader whose daughter had died. Professional mourners wailed in the doorway. The air was thick with disbelief and sorrow, yet Jesus did not allow the crowd to enter. He brought only Peter, James, and John with him. In Mark 5:37, this detail appears almost quietly, but its meaning is profound. John stood only a few feet away when Jesus took the girl's hand and told her to rise. Imagine the shock of seeing her eyes open, hearing her breath fill the silent room, and watching her step forward as if death had never touched her. John saw that with his own eyes. He did not hear it from a friend or read it later. He witnessed the impossible happening in a small private room where only 3 disciples were allowed. Another moment came on a high mountain far away from the crowds. Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him. And there, something happened that no earthly language can fully capture. In Matthew 17:1, the scene is described. Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became radiant. Moses and Elijah appeared beside him, speaking with him. For a few breathtaking moments, the veil between heaven and earth seemed to open, giving these 3 men a glimpse of Christ's true glory. John stood there, stunned, illuminated by light that did not come from this world. It was not a vision. It was not symbolic. It was an event he experienced with his own senses. Then came the night in Gethsemane. Darkness hung low over the olive trees. The air was cool, but the sense of dread was heavy. Jesus brought the disciples with him, but again, he separated 3 of them and took them Father Peter, James, and John. Matthew 26:37 records this moment. John was there when Jesus said his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow, even to the point of death. He heard the trembling in Jesus' voice. We watched him fall face down on the ground. He felt the weight of that night, the tension, the agony, and the burden Jesus carried. This was not a distant theological idea. This was a moment of raw humanity and divine purpose intertwined, and John was close enough to see tears on the ground where Jesus prayed. These scenes tell us something extraordinary about the relationship between Jesus and John. There were 12 disciples, yet John was consistently brought into the deepest, most vulnerable, and most revealing moments of Jesus' ministry. Their closeness is seen most clearly during the Last Supper, the final meal before the crucifixion. The Gospel describes a powerful detail. In John 13:25, we are told that John leaned against Jesus' chest to ask him who would betray him. This was not simply a casual gesture. In the cultural setting of the first century, reclining at a table meant lying close enough that one person could rest near the chest of another. To lean in that way required trust, affection, and familiarity. It was the posture of a beloved disciple, someone welcomed into personal space without hesitation. That moment also reveals something about Jesus. He allowed John that closeness. He welcomed that intimacy. The relationship was not only based on teaching or authority, it was built on friendship, loyalty, and deep personal connection. At the foot of the cross, this connection became even clearer. When almost everyone else fled, John remained near Jesus as he suffered. In John 19:26 and 27, Jesus entrusted his mother to John's care. This was more than a request. It was a declaration of trust. Jesus chose John to carry a responsibility that would last the rest of his life. All these experiences shaped John's voice. When he spoke about Jesus, he spoke as someone who had seen, touched, and heard him in the most intimate moments. His words carried the authority of a direct witness. That is why early Christians listened to him with such reverence, and it is why the Roman Empire feared him. His testimony could not be dismissed. It could not be altered. It could not be replaced. John was not repeating stories. He was recounting events he lived through. Silencing that kind of witness required more than a court order. It required eliminating the man himself. And that is why John eventually became the empire's most dangerous target. After the resurrection of Jesus, the disciples stepped into a world that was both hopeful and hostile. The risen Christ had strengthened their faith, but the political and religious tensions around them were higher than ever. John, once known as a fiery young fisherman, now carried a new kind of authority. He was no longer simply a loyal follower. He was becoming a foundational pillar of the early Christian movement. Someone the believers trusted, and someone the leaders of Jerusalem depended on. The turning point came during Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit filled the apostles with boldness and clarity. The book of Acts describes how thousands were added to the faith in a single day. In Acts 2:41, this moment marks the beginning of a movement that would cross borders and challenge empires. John was right there in the middle of it, not as a background figure, but as an active leader, shaping the direction of the growing community. He stood beside Peter repeatedly, and the two of them became an inseparable team. In the early chapters of Acts, one defining moment happened when Peter and John went to the temple at the hour of prayer. A man who had been lame from birth was carried to the gate called Beautiful. Peter spoke healing in the name of Jesus, and the man rose to his feet for the first time in his life. John witnessed the miracle, supported Peter, and together they faced the stunned crowd that gathered in amazement. This event is recorded in Acts chapter 3, where both men speak boldly, reminding the people that the power they saw did not come from human ability, but from the risen Christ. This public display of power immediately drew the attention of the authorities. In Acts 4, John and Peter were arrested and questioned by the Sanhedrin. Yet even in a setting designed to intimidate, the two disciples stood firm. Their courage confused the leaders, who recognized that these were ordinary men with extraordinary confidence. John was no longer the impulsive son of thunder. He was a steady and fearless presence, someone who refused to be silenced even when threatened by violence. His influence extended beyond Jerusalem. As Christianity spread, John became a shepherd to communities throughout Asia Minor. Cities like Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum looked to him not only as an apostle but as a mentor. He guided young leaders, corrected misunderstandings about the teachings of Jesus, and strengthened churches facing internal conflict and external pressure. His letters reflect this pastoral heart. They are filled with reminders to walk in truth, remain faithful, and show genuine love to one another. In Ephesus especially, John became almost a spiritual father. Believers there saw him not as a distant authority but as someone who lived among them, taught them, and shaped their understanding of the gospel. His presence helped stabilize the churches during turbulent years, when false teachers tried to distort the message of Christ, and when persecution threatened to scatter believers. He provided clarity when confusion arose, comfort when fear spread, and direction when the future felt uncertain. John's role in the early church proves that he was never a wanderer or a passive observer. He was deeply involved, deeply committed, and deeply trusted. His leadership was built on experience, compassion, first-hand knowledge of Jesus. This combination made him a pillar in the early Christian world, a man whose words carried authority and whose life embodied the message he preached. To understand why John became such a dangerous figure in the eyes of Rome, we must step into the world shaped by emperors' political suspicion and a growing obsession with absolute loyalty. The Roman Empire was vast, powerful, and diverse, stretching across continents and uniting millions under a single banner. But the unity of Rome did not come naturally, had to be enforced. And during the reign of Domitian, the enforcement of loyalty took on a new, intense, and deeply personal form. Domitian was not the first emperor to face tension with Christians, but he differed from his predecessors in both severity and motivation. Nero, who ruled decades earlier, unleashed a brutal wave of persecution following the Great Fire of Rome. His violence was chaotic, emotional, and often theatrical. Domitian, however, operated with a colder strategy. His reign was marked by administrative control, calculated suspicion, and the demand for absolute obedience. Where Nero acted out of impulse, Domitian acted out of ideology. At the center of Domitian's vision for the empire was a revived imperial cult, a system that placed the emperor in a role far beyond political authority. Domitian insisted on being addressed with titles of divinity, expecting citizens across the empire to honor him as a godlike figure. He demanded not only respect but worship. Temples were dedicated in his name. Images of him were placed in public spaces and ceremonies were organized to burn incense in his honor. In many cities, refusing this worship was not considered a private religious choice. It was seen as rebellion against the empire itself. Domitian's insistence on divine status created a dangerous collision between the state and the teachings of the early church. Christians could honor the emperor, pray for him, and submit to Roman law, but they could not call any man Lord and God. Their loyalty belonged to God alone. Scriptures like Deuteronomy 6:13 declared that worship was reserved for the Lord, and this conviction created an unavoidable conflict. Domitian interpreted Christian refusal not as religious integrity, but as political defiance. And in an empire where unity was held together by loyalty to the emperor, defiance could not be tolerated. To maintain control, Domitian passed measures that strengthened the enforcement of emperor worship. Provincial governors were instructed to monitor their populations closely. Local officials were required to identify and report anyone who refused to participate in imperial ceremonies. Punishments varied, but they were always severe enough to send a clear message. Some were fined, others were exiled, many were executed, trials were swift, evidence was minimal, and accusations often came from informants seeking favor with the authorities. Christians became especially vulnerable because their communities were tightly connected, publicly visible, and rapidly growing. They gathered regularly, shared teachings openly, and refused to offer incense to the emperor. Their unity made them strong, but it also made them an easy target. Any prominent Christian leader was considered a threat to imperial stability, and none were more prominent than the surviving apostles. John stood out sharply. He had walked with Jesus, witnessed his ministry, and carried a message rooted in loyalty to God, rather than loyalty to Rome. His influence reached across the Mediterranean, and his presence alone inspired courage in believers facing intimidation. Rome's governing strategy toward enemies of the cult was systematic. If someone refused emperor worship, the first step was interrogation. If the person persisted, officials escalated to public punishment. The most threatening individuals were either executed or exiled to remote places where their voices would fade into silence. By removing influential leaders, Rome hoped to weaken the spiritual backbone of the Christian communities. They believed that if the shepherds were taken away, the flocks would scatter. This was part of the logic behind Domitian's policies, and it shaped how the empire responded to John's growing reputation. John's location made the situation even more tense. He lived and ministered in Ephesus, one of the most significant cities in Asia Minor. This region was a major center of imperial worship. Temples dedicated to the emperor stood tall in cities across the province, and loyalty to Rome was woven into civic identity. Refusing to honor the emperor in Asia Minor was not simply unpopular. It was dangerous. The local economy, social structure, and political stability were all tied to the imperial system. Anyone who challenged it, intentionally or unintentionally, created friction that could not be ignored. Ephesus itself was a powerful cultural and commercial hub. Trade flowed through its harbor. Philosophers, merchants, and travelers moved in and out constantly. Ideas spread quickly there, and movements gained momentum with ease. When John taught about Jesus, people listened. When he encouraged believers facing pressure, they found strength. His presence bolstered the Christian communities at a time when Rome desperately wanted them weakened. From the perspective of the empire, a man like John living in a city like Ephesus was a threat waiting to explode. It was only a matter of time before Domitian's government turned its eyes toward him. John's refusal to honor the emperor, combined with his spiritual authority, made him a prime target for political suppression. His influence was growing too fast. reaching too far and encouraging too many people to resist the pressure of emperor worship. What began as religious tension became a political crisis, and for Rome, the solution was clear. John had to be removed. When the Roman authorities finally decided to act against John, their plan was not impulsive. It was deliberate, shaped through layers of suspicion, political pressure, and silent resentment toward the influence he carried. The arrest did not happen in the chaos of a riot or in the shadow of night. It was carried out with purpose, almost like the opening move of a carefully prepared strategy. Officials had monitored his movements for months. They had collected complaints from those who opposed his teachings. And when the order came from higher authority, soldiers moved quietly through Ephesus to take him into custody. John did not resist. He knew this moment would come eventually. The teachings of Jesus had prepared him for it. He had once heard the words recorded in John 15:19, where Jesus warned that the world would hate those who did not belong to it. John remembered that truth as soldiers bound his hands and led him through the crowded streets. From Ephesus, he was transported under guard toward the heart of the empire. The journey to Rome was long and difficult. Along the way, rumors spread through Christian communities, stirring fear and prayer in equal measure. For Rome, the purpose was simple: bring him before the imperial court, discredit him publicly, and end his influence. The Roman legal system, though advanced for its time, was often shaped by political motives when dealing with cases like this. A public trial in Rome was not simply a courtroom proceeding. It was a performance. The space itself was intimidating. Marble floors, towering columns, guards stationed along every wall, and magistrates elevated above the accused. The atmosphere sent a clear message. This was not a place for truth. It was a place for control. While Rome claimed to value justice, trials involving religious defiance were often predetermined. Officials needed only enough theatrics to justify the sentence. When John was brought into the chamber, a crowd had already gathered. Curious citizens, informants, skeptics, and critics filled the room. They wanted to see the man whose words had stirred so many. The case presented against him was built on accusations crafted to fit the empire's agenda. False witnesses were brought forward, echoing a pattern familiar from earlier Christian history. These individuals claimed that John encouraged rebellion, that he taught disrespect for Roman tradition, and that he threatened the unity of the empire. Their accounts contradicted one another, but that did not matter. The structure of the trial had been set long before John ever entered the room. Roman prosecutors spoke with confidence, painting him as a danger to society. They emphasized his refusal to worship the emperor, portraying it as an act of treason rather than a matter of conscience. They argued that his teachings were destabilizing entire communities, and that allowing him to continue would weaken the authority of Rome. The crowd reacted with murmurs, as some convinced, others unsure. And through it all, John stood silently, his hands chained, his face calm. Despite the pressure, John did not offer a dramatic defense. He did not plead for mercy. Instead, he spoke with clarity and peace, affirming the message he had taught for decades. He declared his loyalty to God, echoing the truth he later wrote in 1 John 4:4, that the one within believers is greater than the forces of the world. His voice did not tremble. His words did not shift to satisfy the expectations of the authorities. For John, this moment was not about winning an argument. It was about remaining faithful. As the trial continued, officials grew frustrated. They could not manipulate him, could not intimidate him. Every tactic they used failed to shake his resolve. John knew that his life did not rest in the hands of the judges. His peace came from the same confidence Paul once expressed in 2 Timothy 1:12. Trusting that God is able to guard what is entrusted to him, that confidence shone through John's demeanor. He was not afraid. By the end of the proceedings, the verdict was predictable. The court declared him guilty of rejecting the imperial cult and spreading a teaching that challenged the authority of Rome. The sentence would be execution carried out publicly to send a message to all who watched. The trial had never been about justice. It had been about removing a witness whose testimony carried too much truth and too much power. And now, with the sentence announced and the crowd buzzing with expectation, the empire prepared to do what it believed would finally silence the last living apostle. When the Roman officials finalized John's sentence, they faced an important decision. The empire did not want a quiet execution. They wanted something unforgettable, something that would echo through the streets of Rome and reach every corner of the provinces. A private death could not serve their purpose. They needed a public spectacle, a demonstration of imperial authority strong enough to frighten anyone who considered resisting the emperor's demands. And for this reason, the Colosseum became the chosen stage. The Colosseum was not simply an arena, it was a symbol of Roman identity, a massive stone monument where entertainment, violence, and politics merged into a single display of power. Tens of thousands of spectators gathered there to watch gladiators clash, animals imported from distant lands fight to the death, and prisoners executed in creative and brutal ways. The roar of the crowd often drowned out the cries of the condemned. For Rome, these events reinforced the strength of the empire, reminding every observer that the emperor controlled life and death. Executions were woven into the culture of entertainment, transforming punishment into a performance that shaped public opinion. Bringing John to this place served a clear purpose. Rome wanted to show that even the most respected Christian leader could not resist the emperor's authority. The more public the punishment, the stronger the message. Officials believed that watching the last surviving apostle die would weaken the growing movement and discourage believers. Refused to offer incense to the emperor. The Colosseum, with its towering walls and thunderous crowds, provided the perfect backdrop for the empire's intended display of dominance. The method chosen for Jay's execution reflected the same intention. Soldiers prepared a massive iron cauldron in the center of the arena, placing it above a roaring fire. Oil was poured in until the cauldron was nearly full. As the flames intensified, the oil began to bubble and spit, sending bursts of heat into the air. The sound of the fire crackling beneath the metal blended with the restless murmurs of the crowd. The heat radiating from the cauldron was so intense that even the soldiers standing near it shifted uncomfortably. Every part of the setup was designed to create anticipation. The glowing iron, the rising smoke, and the smell of burning fuel turned the arena into a stage of fear. The crowd leaned forward, waiting to see the old man brought into the center. Rome believed this moment would reaffirm its power, proving that no miracle, no testimony, and no faith could withstand the might of the empire. They had no idea what was about to happen next. The Colosseum grew strangely quiet as John was led into the arena. Moments earlier, the crowd had roared with excitement, but now a curious hush swept across the massive structure. Tens of thousands watched the old apostle walk across the sand. Each step slow but steady, his hands bound, his face calm. The sunlight poured down from above, catching the rising smoke from the cauldron and casting shifting shadows across the lower levels of the stands. The fire beneath the iron pot cracked and snapped, throwing bursts of orange light across the arena floor. The heat radiating from the giant vessel was so strong that even from a distance, the waves of air seemed to shimmer. John felt the uneven ground beneath his feet, the rough pull of the ropes around his wrists, and the overwhelming intensity of the moment. But inside, he carried a stillness that did not come from himself. The words of the Psalms were alive in him, especially the truth written in Psalm 31-15. "My times are in thy hand." With each step, that truth sank deeper into his heart. Soldiers on either side gripped their weapons tightly as if they expected him to resist, but he did not. He simply walked. The murmur of the crowd rose again, swelling like a wave. People leaned forward in anticipation. Some shouted insults. Others watched with an uneasy curiosity. A few remained silent, unsure how to feel about the execution of a man whose reputation for holiness had spread across the empire. The emperor himself sat in a private viewing area, surrounded by guards and officials. Domitian's eyes followed every movement, waiting for the moment when his power would be displayed for all of Rome to see. As John reached the center, a soldier shouted an order, and the arena shifted. The execution team spread out around the cauldron. The metal glowed red at the edges, the oil inside boiling violently. Each pop of the bubbling liquid echoed like small explosions. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the stinging scent of hot oil, creating a sharp, suffocating heat. The air itself felt alive. John stood only a few paces from the cauldron now. Sweat gathered on the soldiers' brows. The crowd leaned forward as one. The fire crackled so loudly that it almost drowned out the sound of the announcer's voice as he proclaimed the charge: refusal to worship the emperor, defiance of the imperial cult, and the spreading of a message that challenged Rome's authority. Then came the moment the executioner raised his arm. A soldier positioned himself behind John. Another tightened his grip on the rope. The command was given, and in a single motion, John was lifted and pushed toward the boiling cauldron. For an instant, everything slowed. The sound of the crowd blurred into a distant hum. The fire's glow danced across John's face. His robes fluttered in the hot wind, and then he fell. The impact of his body hitting the oil should have created agonizing screams, should have produced the smell of burning flesh. It should have ended his life in seconds. Instead, something entirely unexpected unfolded before the eyes of everyone present. The surface of the oil broke around him with a heavy splash, but the usual sound of searing did not follow. No smoke rose from his skin. John did not writhe or cry out, did not claw his way to the edge or sink beneath the liquid, simply stood steady and unharmed inside the boiling cauldron, his expression calm, his eyes lifted as if he were praying silently. Soldiers froze where they stood. The executioners stared in disbelief. A murmur rippled through the arena. People blinked, leaned forward, stood up, and tried to convince themselves that they were not seeing what they were seeing. The oil continued to bubble around John, splashing against the sides of the cauldron. Yet none of it touched him with harm. Some of the crowd gasped. Others began to whisper nervously. The sound spread like a pressure wave across the Colosseum. Shock turned to fear. Fear turned to awe, and awe turned to something that felt dangerously close to reverence. John's calmness only amplified the effect. He showed no sign of distress, no sign of pain, no sign that the boiling liquid beneath him had any power at all. Too many watching, the scene brought to mind stories from the scriptures, especially those of the young Hebrews who were thrown into the fiery furnace in Babylon, yet came out untouched as described in Daniel 3:27. Whether the crowd understood the connection or not, the emotion in the air was unmistakable. Something unexplained, unexplainable was happening before their eyes. A large portion of the arena fell silent. Others began to cry out in alarm. A few dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. Some shouted prayers. Some covered their faces. Others backed away as though standing too close to the miracle might bring consequences. The soldiers closest to the cauldron looked at one another, unsure what to do. The executioner, now trembling, hesitated. He had never seen anything like this in his life. No training had prepared him for a man who refused to die. Finally, an officer shouted for the soldiers to pull John out. They stepped forward carefully, gripping long hooks and ropes designed to remove bodies after an execution. But this time, the body they lifted was standing upright and entirely unharmed. John stepped out of the cauldron as though he had been immersed in nothing more than warm water. His robes were intact, his face was serene. His hands, though still bound, did not tremble. When the crowd saw him emerge untouched, a wave of panic and astonishment swept through the Colosseum. Some people screamed, others collapsed to their knees. More than a few began shouting that the God of John was real, powerful, and present.
For an emperor
who demanded divine worship, this sudden shift in public emotion was dangerous. Domitian rose from his seat, his face stunned, his confidence shaken. He had ordered an execution that was meant to reinforce his godlike status. Instead, he had become a witness to something that made him look powerless. The emperor quickly ordered that the execution be stopped. He refused to attempt a second method. Another failed attempt might inspire the crowd even more. Rome could not risk turning John into a public symbol of divine protection, so the sentence was changed immediately. John would not die. Instead, he would be banished to the island of Patmos, a place of exile far from cities, influence, and public gatherings. Soldiers surrounded him again, but this time their expressions were different. Fear flickered in their eyes. They handled him cautiously, as though unsure whether touching him might bring consequences from a higher power. As John was escorted out of the arena, the atmosphere remained electric with disbelief. People whispered about the miracle. Others stared in silence, unable to process what they had seen. No one in that arena could forget the old man who stood unharmed in boiling oil. And now we reach an important line between history and tradition. Early Christian writers such as Tertullian recorded this event, and it became a key part of Christian tradition. However, Roman historical documents do not provide independent confirmation of the cauldron incident. What we have is a long-standing Christian account supported by early church testimony, not by surviving imperial records. Yet whether one sees it as literal miracle, historical tradition, or a story with symbolic meaning, one thing is certain. This narrative shaped the way generations understood the courage of John, the fearlessness of faith, and the conviction that no empire, no ruler, and no fire could silence the testimony of the last living apostle. The moment John emerged from the cauldron unharmed, the political atmosphere around Domitian shifted. What was meant to be a dramatic demonstration of imperial power had collapsed into a moment of public humiliation. The emperor, who demanded worship as a divine figure, now found himself overshadowed by an old man whose survival suggested the presence of a greater power. Domitian understood the danger immediately. A second attempt at execution could lead to even greater public unrest. If John survived again, the emperor's authority would be shattered. If John died, the crowd might still interpret the first miracle as proof that the Christian God had intervened. Either outcome risked strengthening the very faith mission was trying to suppress. Politically, Domitian needed control, not chaos. He sensed that executing John a second time could ignite support for the Christian movement, especially among citizens who had witnessed the cauldron incident. Fear spread quickly among the officials as well. They recognized that the public had already begun whispering about divine protection. Some people in the crowd had fallen to their knees. Others had cried out loudly that John's God was real. For a ruler who depended on unquestioned loyalty, this shift in emotion was far too dangerous. Domitian made a rapid calculation. Killing John was no longer an advantage. It was a liability. So, he changed strategy. John would not be executed. He would be removed. Exile was the perfect political tool. It eliminated the man's voice without giving the public a martyr. It silenced his influence without risking further miracles. And it created distance between him and the growing Christian communities in Asia. Minor Domitian ordered that John be sent to the island of Patmos, a rocky and isolated place used by Rome to confine prisoners who posed ideological or political threats. The goal was not mercy. The goal was containment. The logistics began immediately. Soldiers escorted John from the Colosseum to a holding area near the port. The chains around his wrists remained, but the expressions on the soldiers' faces had changed. They were cautious, hesitant, unsure of the man they were guarding. A ship waited at the docks built for transporting both cargo and prisoners. The sea winds were strong, and the waves slapped against the wooden hull with force. John was led aboard, surrounded by guards who kept their distance as though the miracle might still be lingering around him. As the vessel pulled away from the shore, Rome believed it had finally found the solution. Not execution, but isolation. Not death, but silence. What they did not know was that the island they chose as a prison would become the place where John received visions that shaped the final book of the New Testament. Patmos was not the kind of place where a man simply lived. It was the kind of place where a man endured. When the Roman ship finally cut through the last stretch of water and the jagged outline of the island came into view, John would have seen a landscape shaped by wind, stone, and silence. Patmos was a small island in the Ion Sea, barren and uneven, with steep ridges running across its surface and few areas suitable for human settlement. The soil was thin and rocky. Vegetation was sparse. Sharp gusts of wind swept across the cliffs and carried the echo of crashing waves that broke relentlessly against the shore. It was a harsh setting, one that seemed designed not merely to isolate, but to wear a person down. When prisoners arrived, they were not given comfort. There were no accommodations waiting, no shelters prepared, no spaces set aside for rest. Exile on Patmos meant hard labor. Rome used islands like this to dispose of people considered dangerous, not for their crimes, but for their influence. Prisoners were often assigned to quarries where they broke stones from sunrise to sunset. Others carried heavy loads along uneven paths, their hands blistered and raw. The work was exhausting. Food was minimal and coarse, often little more than bread, olives, and water. Medical care was nearly non-existent. If a prisoner fell ill, he survived only if his body fought hard enough. Many did not. John, already an elderly man by the time he was sent there, felt the weight of this reality immediately. The days were long and physically demanding. The nights were cold and unprotected. Wind slipped through every crack and crevice, carrying a biting chill that made sleep difficult. And yet, through all of this, John remained steady. The hardship did not crush him. The loneliness did not break him. If anything, it created a space where his spirit could listen more clearly than ever before. Life on Patmos stripped away every distraction. There were no crowds, no churches to shepherd, no debates to settle, no gatherings to lead. There was only the work, the silence, and the presence of God. John had always been a man of deep devotion, but exile deepened that devotion in ways he could not have anticipated. Prayer became not just a discipline, but a lifeline. The rhythm of his days shifted. Hard labor shaped his body, but communion with God shaped his heart. In the stillness of the island, he remembered the voice of Jesus from years earlier. He recalled moments beside the Sea of Galilee, moments of laughter around firelight, moments of awe on the mountain of transfiguration, moments of anguish in Gethsemane. Every memory sharpened, becoming almost luminous against the bleakness of Patmos. Over time, isolation began to work like a refining fire. John's body grew weary, but his spirit grew sharper. His hunger for God increased. The absence of human companionship did not create emptiness. It created space. And into that space, God began to speak in ways John had never experienced before. The apostle could feel it before he could explain it as stirring, a deepening, a sense that heaven was drawing near. This spiritual sensitivity reached its climax on a day John later described with a phrase that has echoed through centuries. In Revelation 1:10, he writes that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. He does not say he was lost in imagination. He does not describe a dream or a symbolic meditation. He describes a state of profound spiritual clarity, a moment where the gap between earth and heaven narrowed until the presence of God overwhelmed every other reality around him. That phrase, "in the Spirit on the Lord's day," marks the beginning of one of the most extraordinary experiences any human being has ever recorded. John was not sitting in comfort. He was not inside a temple. He was not surrounded by a congregation. He was standing in exile, likely worn from work, surrounded by barren landscape and the distant sound of crashing waves. Yet that was the moment God chose. Not Jerusalem, not Ephesus, not any place touched by honor or recognition. God chose Patmos, the island meant to silence him, as the place where his voice would thunder. John later wrote that he heard a voice behind him, a voice as loud and clear as a trumpet. The sound startled him so strongly that he turned immediately. And when he turned, everything changed. The rugged landscape of Patmos faded into the background, replaced by a vision so powerful that human language strains to capture it. He saw one standing among 7 golden lampstands. The figure looked like the Son of Man, clothed in a long robe with a golden sash across his chest. John described the one he saw using details that flowed like pure fire. His hair white as wool, his eyes burning like flames, his feet shining like polished brass, his voice like the roar of many waters. In Revelation 1, ES 9-20, John recounts how the one he saw held 7 stars in his right hand, and how a sharp 2-edged sword came from his mouth. The entire scene radiated authority, beauty, and overwhelming power. For a moment, John could not stand under the weight of it. He fell at the feet of the one before him, overcome by the majesty of the vision, and then he felt the touch of a hand. Not the harsh grip of a Roman soldier, not the pull of a guard's chain. It was the hand of the risen Christ, the same Jesus John had walked with decades earlier. And the voice he heard was familiar, steady, and filled with assurance. This moment was not a dream, it was an encounter. It was the beginning of revelations that would unveil the spiritual reality behind earthly events, the future of the church, the victory of the Lamb, and the ultimate defeat of darkness. God had taken the place Rome meant for John's silence, and turned it into a place where heaven would speak with thunderous clarity. Patmos, with all its harshness, became holy ground, the very isolation designed to erase. John's influence became the environment where God entrusted him with visions that would shape Christian understanding for generations. The old apostle, worn by exile but strengthened by the Spirit, became the writer of a revelation that continues to echo through history. A revelation born not from comfort but from suffering, not from crowds but from solitude, not from earthly power but from divine encounter. What happened on Patmos did not end with a single vision. It opened a floodgate. When John turned and saw the risen Christ standing in radiant glory, the experience marked the beginning of a series of revelations that would shape Christian faith for centuries. Rome had sent him to the island to silence him. But heaven chose that same island to reveal truths that would outlast every empire. The book that emerged from these visions, known today as Revelation, is not merely a collection of symbolic images. It is a message about sovereignty, redemption, endurance, and hope given to a man who had just survived boiling oil and who now endured exile. The heart of Revelation is a message about who truly reigns. John was living under the most oppressive ruler the early church had known. Domitian demanded worship, enforced his authority through fear, and punished anyone who challenged his godlike status. But when John was taken up in the Spirit, he was shown a throne that made every earthly power look small. In Revelation 4, John describes being brought into a heavenly realm, where a throne stood at the very center of everything. He saw the one seated on it, radiant like jasper and carnelian, surrounded by a rainbow that shone like emerald light. Around the throne, thunder rolled and flashes of lightning burst across the scene. 24 elders fell down in worship, casting their crowns before the throne. Creatures, unlike anything on earth, cried out without ceasing, proclaiming the holiness of the one who reigns forever. The message of the vision was unmistakable. Power does not belong to Rome. Authority does not come from emperors. Sovereignty is not determined by earthly kingdoms. The throne of heaven is unmoved, unshaken, and unequaled. Heaven was pulling back the curtain for John, showing him that everything happening on earth, even persecution, exile, and suffering, rested under the authority of the one on the throne. For a man who had just faced death by oil and who now lived in isolation, this vision was more than symbolic. It was a confirmation. Rome believed it controlled his fate. But the throne John saw declared otherwise. The one seated in heaven, not Domitian, held the true power. And through this vision, John understood why he had survived. His life was preserved because he had more to witness, more to record, and more to share with the believers who needed courage to stand against the demands of the empire. From the throne room, the vision intensified. John saw a scroll in the right hand of the one seated on the throne. It was sealed 7 times, and no one, no ruler, no angel, no spiritual being, was found worthy to open it. John writes that he wept when he saw that no one could open the scroll because the scroll contained the unfolding of God's redemptive plan for the world. But then one of the elders spoke words that changed everything. "Weep not." John looked up and he saw the answer standing before the throne. He saw a lamb. The lamb looked as though it had been slain, yet it was alive. In Revelation 5, John describes the lamb approaching the throne and taking the scroll into his hands. At that moment, heaven erupted in worship. Angels, elders, and every creature in God's presence declared the worthiness of the lamb. Why? Because the lamb had conquered death. The imagery was unmistakable. The lamb was Christ himself, the one John had followed, the one he had leaned against at the Last Supper, the one who entrusted his mother to him at the cross, the one who now stood in eternal victory. The vision of the Lamb revealed the foundation of Christian hope. Christ was not merely a teacher or a martyr. He was the Redeemer, the one who paid the price for humanity's salvation. His sacrifice unlocked the scroll, meaning that God's plan for the world would move forward not through military conquest, not through empire or politics, but through the victory of the Lamb who gave his life. This revelation explained John's survival in a deeper way. He lived because the Lamb had preserved him. He endured because the Lamb still had a mission for him. And he saw these visions because the Lamb wanted the church to understand the truth. Redemption belongs to Christ alone. From there, John witnessed a sweeping panorama of spiritual events: the breaking of the seals, the sounding of the trumpets, the pouring out of the bowls. Each one revealed the unfolding of history and the cosmic battle between good and evil. But these visions were not given to frighten believers. They were given to strengthen them. At the time, John wrote, Christians across the empire faced persecution, isolation, and pressure to conform to the imperial cult. They needed clarity, courage, and assurance that their suffering had purpose. This is why the book begins with letters to 7 specific churches. In Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, John records the words Christ spoke to the churches of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Each message contains a balance of encouragement and warning. Christ affirms their endurance, corrects their errors, warns them against compromise, and calls them to stand firm. These messages show that Revelation is not only about future events, it is deeply pastoral, cares for real people facing real struggles. To the church in Smyrna, Christ offers comfort in suffering. To the church in Philadelphia, he gives assurance of protection. To the church in Laodicea, he calls for renewed devotion. These messages remind the believers that they are seen, known, and guided by Christ himself. For Christians under Domitian's rule, this was revolutionary. They felt the weight of political oppression every day. They saw idols and imperial altars everywhere. But Revelation told them a different story. Christ walks among his churches. Christ holds the 7 stars in his hand. Christ sees the faithful and strengthens them. When John looked at the larger visions, the judgments, the cosmic conflict, the final victory, he saw the end of every force that opposed God. He saw Babylon representing corrupt earthly power fall. He saw the beast and the false prophet defeated, saw evil brought to judgment. And through it all, he saw the Lamb victorious, leading his people into a new heaven and a new earth. This message spoke directly into the fear and uncertainty of the Domian era. Believers were tempted to wonder whether the empire was stronger than their faith. They questioned whether following Christ was worth the danger. Revelation answered their fears with overwhelming clarity. Earthly rulers rise and fall. Empires appear powerful for a moment and then vanish into history. But the throne of God remains. The Lamb reigns forever. And those who endure will share in his victory. The visions of Revelation did not come to John by accident. They came because God preserved him for this purpose. The same power that sustained him through boiling oil, the same hand that guided him to Patmos, now opened his eyes to the unseen reality behind the world's suffering. Revelation connected the miracle of John's physical survival with the miracle of divine revelation. The man the empire tried to destroy became the man who witnessed the ultimate triumph of God. When the order finally arrived, releasing John from exile, it marked the beginning of one of the most unexpected chapters of his life. Many people in Asia Minor believed that the aging apostle would never return from Patmos. Yet he stepped back onto the shores of Ephesus alive, walking slowly but carrying a presence that felt heavier than before, one shaped by suffering, survival, and divine revelation. News of his return spread quickly through the Christian communities. Some wept when they saw him, overwhelmed by the realization that the last living apostle had survived the cauldron, the island, and the empire. They expected him to rest, but John did not withdraw. He resumed his ministry with a quiet determination, focusing on the churches that had struggled during the years of persecution in Ephesus. John devoted himself to teaching and guiding the leaders who were responsible for the growing congregations throughout Asia Minor. He carried no wealth, no political status, and no earthly power. Only the testimony of a man who had touched Christ, walked with him, and received visions on Patmos. It was during this final period of his ministry that John completed the writings that would become central pillars of the New Testament. The Gospel of John, written with a unique depth of reflection, presents Christ not only as the Messiah in history, but as the eternal Word, the one through whom all things were made. His first, second, and third epistles offer guidance to believers facing false teachings, spiritual confusion, and community conflicts. And the revelation he received on Patmos stood as a prophetic declaration that Christ reigns over all the ages. But beyond the miracles, the visions, and the writings, one theme marked John's final years more than anything else: love. Those who carried him into meetings because age had weakened. His body recalled that he often repeated the same simple phrase, "Little children, love one another." He did not say it out of habit. He said it because he believed it contained the core of the Christian life. In the gospel he wrote, he recorded Christ's command in John 13:34, where Jesus said that his followers must love one another as he has loved them. John had lived long enough to understand that love was not weakness, but strength. It sustained the church through persecution, anchored believers in truth, and reflected the heart of Christ more clearly than any argument or miracle. John's legacy grew, as the years passed. Generations of pastors and believers looked to his writings for clarity, hope, and courage. His gospel became a doorway for countless people to understand the identity of Christ. His epistles guided the early church in unity and holiness. His revelations shaped the Christian imagination for centuries, reminding believers that suffering is never the end of the story. And his life spared from boiling oil, preserved through exile, strengthened in old age, became a living testimony that God completes his purposes through those who remain faithful. John did not seek to be remembered. He simply sought to bear witness. And because of that, his voice continues to echo through history, calling every generation to the same message he repeated again and again: love one another. When examining the story of John surviving a cauldron of boiling oil, it is essential to approach the evidence with care. The account has been cherished in Christian tradition for centuries, yet historians must separate what is firmly documented from what has been transmitted through later writings. The earliest and most important source is the work of Eusebius of Caesarea, a 4th century historian, often called the father of church history. In his monumental work, Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius preserved the testimony of earlier authors, including the 2nd-century writer Irenaeus. Eusebius records that Domitian persecuted Christians and that John was exiled to Patmos, but he does not explicitly mention the boiling oil incident. This silence is significant because often included dramatic accounts of martyrdom when earlier sources preserved them. The most detailed version of the story appears in the writings of Tertullian, a Christian author from the late 2nd and early 3rd century. Tertullian states that John was plunged into boiling oil in Rome and emerged unharmed before being exiled to Patmos. Jerome, a 4th century scholar best known for translating the Bible into Latin, also echoes this tradition, treating it as an established event in Christian memory. These sources present a consistent narrative, but they come several generations after the events themselves. None of them claim direct eyewitness testimony, and no Roman records mention the incident. The lack of contemporary Roman documentation is not unusual, since the empire rarely recorded executions or failed executions of religious dissidents. Still, because the earliest accounts appear more than a century after John's death, historians must acknowledge the gap. Modern scholars offer a range of interpretations. Some argue that the consistency of the story across early Christian writers suggests it reflects a real memory preserved by the Church. Others note that miraculous survival stories were common in ancient martyr traditions, intended to inspire courage and highlight divine protection. A few scholars propose that the boiling oil episode may have developed as an expansion of the well-documented fact that John was exiled under Domitian. They suggest that early Christians may have shaped the story to emphasize God's protection of the last living apostle. Because the tradition is strong but not supported by contemporary documentation, academic debate continues. A balanced conclusion recognizes both sides. On one hand, early Christian writers close to the events affirmed the story, and they had no incentive to invent details that could be easily challenged by their audiences. On the other hand, the absence of first-century sources means that historians cannot treat the account as verified fact. The most responsible approach is to acknowledge that the boiling oil narrative is a deeply rooted and remarkably enduring tradition within early Christianity, but one that lacks direct historical confirmation from the time it is said to have occurred. For believers, the story reflects the conviction that God protects his servants. For scholars, it remains a compelling tradition supported by later testimony, but not by contemporary evidence. When we step back from the dramatic scenes of boiling oil, exile, and heavenly visions, we begin to see that John's story carries a deeper message, one that speaks directly into the fears, pressures, and struggles of modern life. His survival was not only a historical tradition or a miraculous moment, it was a picture of how God works through suffering, through endurance, and through lives that remain faithful despite the weight of opposition. The first theme that emerges is the idea of divine preservation. John lived through threats that no ordinary person could survive. Yet he did not survive because he was strong. He survived because his life still carried purpose. In every season of suffering, there was a mission waiting on the other side. This idea challenges the modern assumption that comfort equals blessing. John's blessing did not appear in the form of ease. It appeared in the form of purpose. His pain became a doorway. His exile opened space for revelation. This shows us that purpose-driven suffering is not meaningless. It is not wasted. When God preserves someone, it is never for survival alone. It is always for transformation, calling, and impact. The miracle is not only that John lived. The miracle is that God used the lowest season of his life to reveal the highest truths of heaven. In today's world, many people feel overwhelmed by pressures, work demands, family burdens, relational disappointments, or cultural hostility toward faith. John's story teaches that suffering does not disqualify someone from being used by God. Instead, suffering can refine a person's vision and sharpen their purpose. It invites the believer to ask not "Why is this happening to me?" but "What is God shaping within me through this?" For John, the answer was clear. Exile did not silence him. It positioned him. A second theme is the role of public witness in seasons of pressure. John lived at a time when confessing Christ could cost everything: status, safety, livelihood, even life itself. Yet he remained a visible witness. He did not hide his loyalty to Christ, and he did not distort the message to protect himself. His presence strengthened entire churches. His letters corrected false teachings, and his testimony carried the authority of someone who had touched, seen, and walked beside the Son of God. Today's challenges look different from ancient persecution, but the pressure remains real. Cultural forces often mock faith, redefine truth, or push believers to stay silent about their convictions. John's example teaches that quiet faithfulness is powerful, but visible faithfulness is transformative. A public witness does not require a stage. It requires consistency. It requires courage. It requires integrity. John did not gain influence by seeking attention. He gained influence by standing firm, when standing firm was costly. In modern society, where compromise is often celebrated, John reminds us that truth spoken with love remains one of the most powerful forces in the world. The final theme moves us into practical application. How this story speaks to real people today. John's life offers several pastoral insights for anyone walking through hardship, doubt, fear, or spiritual weariness. First, do not interpret suffering as abandonment. If John had assumed that exile meant God had forgotten him, he would have missed the vision waiting for him on Patmos. For anyone facing a difficult season, the encouragement is simple. God does his greatest shaping in hidden places. Second, hold tightly to the identity of Christ. John's endurance flowed from his relationship with Jesus, the one he followed from Galilee to the cross and beyond. When life becomes unstable, the character of Christ becomes the anchor. His love, his faithfulness, his authority, and his presence remain unshaken regardless of circumstances. Third, choose love as your defining mark. In his final years, John reduced his message to one simple command: "Little children, love one another." He did so because he understood that love is the foundation of every other form of obedience. Love guards the heart from bitterness. Love strengthens unity. Love reveals Christ more clearly than any sermon or miracle. Finally, John's story invites a response. It calls every listener to examine where they stand, what they believe, and who they belong to. His survival in boiling oil, his endurance in exile, and his reception of heavenly revelation all point toward the same truth. Faith is not a concept. It is a relationship with the living Christ, and that relationship shapes destiny. For anyone who feels distant, discouraged, or uncertain, John's story is an open invitation. If God preserved him through fire, through prison, and through age, then God is more than able to preserve you. If God gave John purpose that outlived every attempt to silence him, then God can give you purpose that rises above every struggle you face. And if Christ walked with John through every chapter of his life, then Christ can walk with you through every chapter of yours. As we reach the end of this journey, we step back and look at everything that has unfolded from the heat of the cauldron in Rome, to the rocky silence of Patmos, to the thunderous visions of heaven, and finally to the lasting legacy John left for the world. When we weave these moments together, a pattern begins to emerge. The story is not random. It is not a series of isolated miracles or tragedies. It forms a continuous arc of purpose. Imagine that first scene again. The crowd roaring inside the Colosseum, the soldiers tightening their grip on John's arms. the boiling oil rising and swirling beneath him like a living flame. By every standard of the ancient world, this should have been the end, should have been the final moment of the last living apostle. Yet the moment he touched the oil, nothing happened. There was no screaming, no burning, no death. What looked like the conclusion became an interruption because his story was not finished. From that moment of survival, John was taken from spectacle to silence. The empire tried to bury him on the island of Patmos, expecting that isolation would crush his spirit and erase his influence. But isolation became the doorway to revelation. John, cut off from cities and crowds, suddenly found himself standing before the throne of heaven. He saw the one seated in glory, saw the Lamb alive and victorious. He saw the future of the church and the unfolding of divine justice. And he wrote it down so that every generation from the first century to ours could understand that no empire, no ruler, and no season of human suffering can overshadow the sovereignty of God. Years later, when John returned to Ephesus, people welcomed him, not merely as a survivor, but as a man transformed. He was not only the apostle who lived, he was the apostle who saw. He became a shepherd to the churches once again, reminding them of the teachings he had heard directly from Christ. He wrote the gospel that reveals Jesus as the eternal Word. He wrote the epistles that anchor the Christian life in love, and he preserved the revelation that continues to shape faith, courage, and hope across centuries. So when we look at the entire arc from boiling oil to Patmos to prophecy to legacy, we see a narrative that stretches far beyond one miraculous moment. It becomes a story about endurance, about divine purpose, about the way God works through the darkest chapters of life to produce the brightest testimony. But alongside this sweeping spiritual message, there is also the academic question. How much of this story can we confirm from history? How much belongs to tradition? The answer requires balance and honesty. The exile to Patmos under Emperor Domitian is historically solid, supported by early sources and the text of Revelation itself. But the story of the boiling oil comes primarily from Christian writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries such as Tertullian and Jerome, rather than from 1st century Roman records. Scholars acknowledge that the tradition is strong and consistent, yet it lacks contemporary documentation. That does not make it untrue. It simply places it in the realm where faith and history often meet, where lived memory, sacred tradition, and historical gaps coexist. What matters even from a scholarly standpoint is that early Christians believed that John's life had been preserved in a miraculous way. His survival became a symbol of divine protection and a testimony that could not be silenced. The miracle did not need Rome's paperwork to change lives. It was the belief itself passed from generation to generation that shaped Christian identity in the face of persecution. The theological message goes even deeper. John's life teaches that God does not preserve someone only to extend their years. He preserves them because their purpose is not yet complete. In John's case, his preservation ensured that the church would receive revelation, that the gospel would be written, and that his testimony would continue to guide believers long after his death. His story invites us to reflect on our own lives. What purposes might still be unfolding in the seasons we do not understand? How might God be working in the quiet places, the painful places, or the hidden places we often try to avoid? John's journey urges us to see suffering through a different lens. It's not as abandonment, but as refinement, not as punishment, but as preparation, not as the end, but as the bridge toward what God intends to reveal. The boiling oil did not define him. Patmos did. The silence of exile shaped him into the man who could hear the voice of heaven clearly. His endurance teaches that faith is often forged not in comfort, but in perseverance. In his final message, the one he repeated again and again, "Little children, love one another," reminds us that the heart of Christianity is not power, spectacle, or argument. It is love. That love carried him through the highs and lows of nearly a century of life. It carried him through persecution. It carried him through suffering, and it carried him into eternity. The story of John is powerful, but it is not meant to remain a distant historical tale. It invites reflection. It invites openness. It invites each listener to examine their own faith, questions, and struggles. You may be watching this from a place of joy or from a place of exhaustion. You may feel close to God, or you may feel distant. You may believe firmly, or you may be unsure. Wherever you are, John's story offers an invitation, not pressured, not forced, simply offered. His life shows that no one is forgotten, no one is beyond reach, no season is without meaning. If you sense something stirring inside you as you listen to this, if you feel a quiet nudge toward hope or a desire to reconnect with God, you are welcome to respond in your own way and in your own time. You can reflect, you can pray silently, you can explore faith with honesty. And if you want to take a personal step, you can say something simple like, "God, guide me." Or, "Help me see what you want me to see." Or, "Restore my faith." There is no formula. There is only sincerity. Okay. And if you already walk with Christ, let this story renew your courage. Let it strengthen your love. Let it fill you with the assurance that God preserves his children for reasons far greater than they often realize. As we close, I want to invite you gently and respectfully to interact with this message in ways that help more people discover it. If this story moved you, encouraged you, or gave you something to think about, consider pressing like. It helps the video reach others. If you want to share your thoughts, I would love to hear them. You can comment below with something simple like, "What do you think about this miracle? You believe it happened, or do you remain unsure?" Every perspective is welcome here. If you want to stay connected, feel free to subscribe. There are many more deep dives, biblical journeys, and historical explorations coming soon. And if you would like to support the channel in a practical way, you can join the membership or contribute through the thank you option. Every form of support helps us continue studying, researching, and creating content that brings scripture and history to life. Above all, thank you for staying with this story. John survived because his purpose was not finished. Maybe that reminder is the one you needed today.